Welcome to Lesson 13 of A Disciple's Guide to Read the Bible. We're going to review two practice passages. These will be the first two passages where you get to practice the entire read process, or at least all four steps. The first passage we're going to look at is Exodus 3. So we've been looking at Exodus 2, and so it'll be good to go ahead and look at Exodus 3. So you should already know the context so that you can read the passage in context. And Exodus 3, same with Genesis 1, which is the second practice passage. Both of these are full of information. And if you were reading these devotionally, honestly, you could probably spend 2 or 3 days. And even if you practice and you want to spend more than one day using the read process to walk through this, that's perfectly acceptable. And so what I'm going to do with Exodus 3 is show you a couple of ways you could work through the read process with this. So first, you would read the passage in context. I've provided the context for you in the workbook, just in case you needed a reminder. But here, Exodus 3, we're going to see this is one of those pivotal chapters in the Bible. And so, as we talked about previously, God's people are enslaved in Egypt. Moses grew up as a son of Pharaoh's daughter, kills a man, has to flee Egypt, and here we find him. He's gotten married, and now he's taking care of a flock of sheep, and he encounters this burning bush. And I'm sure you've heard about the burning bush referred to in the Bible. And so in this story, you see this encounter between Moses and God. And so how could you engage the text? Well, one way would be to simply follow the story of how God reveals himself to Moses. So here in the first part of it, through verse 6, is God showing up in this burning bush. And if you think about Moses in this instance, you've got this, it's a scene of mystery. If you're Moses, he's even like, hey, what's going on here? But there's also a sense of God's majesty. Whenever God says, take your sandals off, you're on holy ground because you're in my presence. And then you can continue to read, and as you look at the interaction between Moses and God, how God is revealing himself. Yes, he starts off revealing himself in somewhat of a mystery, and yet at the same time majestically. And then in verses 7 through 12, God reveals himself as a God who hears his people, a God who sees his people, a God who's coming to deliver his people. So yes, he is holy and majestic, but yet he is also near to us. He comes to deliver us. And there's again some back and forth between Moses. Moses is he asks a question. Moses says there in verse 11, hey, who am I that I shall go? And then God answers him. And then verse 13, Moses says, well, if I go and say to the people, God said, let's go, who should I really say sent me? And this is one of those where you may not know this, and this is where a study Bible would help, but what God reveals about himself here in verses, really say 13 through 15, is one of the key names of God. This is, if you've ever heard of God referred to the name Yahweh, this is where this comes, where he says, God said to Moses, I am who I am. And basically what he is saying is, whenever the people ask who sent you, tell them that I am who I am sent you, or tell you that I am. And you may be thinking, well, what in the world does this mean? And this is where a study Bible would help. And what this means is that God is telling to Moses, I simply exist. God is saying that he exists outside of time. He is not dependent on anyone. He exists outside of his creation. He simply exists. And so you get back to this majesty of God, this holiness of God, and yet it is this holy, majestic, independent, all-powerful God. He is transcendent, and yet he comes to rescue his people. He comes to send Moses to rescue his people. And so if you just kind of picked up on that interaction, then the ask portion becomes very easy to answer. What does this say about God? And we've really already sort of answered it with this passage, or with how we engage the text here. But this tells us that God is holy, yet he comes to his people. God is holy, but he is approachable, that we can come to him. That God is holy, but he hears us, he sees us. And so whenever you think through that, then whenever it comes to discipleship application, then you can say, okay, is there something in my life I need to take to God? Or do I need to approach God? Or am I living my life afraid to approach God, and not with a healthy fear, but just a fear of, well, God doesn't even, he's too busy. That type of unbiblical fear. And so you could apply this by coming to God in prayer, or apply this just by meditating on the glory and majesty of God throughout your day, throughout your week. So it's one way you could work through the read process. The second way is a little bit simpler. Let's just say you kind of don't pick up all of that. I've got one verse underlined in my Bible here. It is verse 12. And this is after Moses asked, who am I to go and bring your children out of Egypt? God says in verse 12, but I will be with you, and this shall be the sign for you. When you have brought the people out of Egypt, you shall serve God on this mountain. And this is one of those where you don't have to understand everything to understand something, way to engage the text, because it's very interesting. Moses asked for a sign, or how, who am I? And God says, well, I'm going to give you a sign. But the sign comes after Moses leads God's people. It's not, hey, tomorrow I'm going to give you a sign so that you know this is what you're supposed to do. No, God says to Moses, this is what you're supposed to do. After you follow me in obedience, after you trust me, then you will see, this will be the sign, this will be the evidence that I was with you all along. You're going to come and worship me on this very mountain that I'm revealing myself to you right now. And so in this particular instance, that can stand out for a variety of ways. And then as you think about, okay, well, what does this say about God? Well, it says that sometimes what God's going to do is call us to follow him in faith. That he's going to call us to do something, command us to do something, and the evidence that it was the right thing to do may not be immediate. That you may follow God in faith and obedience, and maybe things don't immediately go well for you, which things don't go well for Moses when he first goes back to Egypt. And so this can encourage your faith. So this gets to, okay, discipleship application. Maybe God's calling you to step out in faith in some way. Maybe you're kind of going through that. You're like, God, I thought you wanted me to do this, but you're struggling to see the evidence or the sign, if you will, that yes, this is what you should have done. Well, that may come later. And so maybe that's a way you could work through the read process, understand something, and apply it to your life. So hopefully this helps. I'm here with Exodus 3. Now looking at Genesis 1. Again, it's another long passage. You can actually read all the way to chapter 2, verse 3. But another long chapter where, again, you could do probably 2 or 3 days of devotions from this, applying the read method. And there's, again, numerous ways you could engage the text. But first, this one, as we talk about reading the passage in context, it's at the very beginning of the Bible, so there's really no immediate context in terms of what comes before it, and so it's pretty easy to read this passage in context. And as you're engaging this text, again, there's numerous ways you could do it. I put a hint in the workbook that you can look for a certain pattern, structure, repeating phrases in the passage as a way to pick up on things that you can learn and eventually apply. And there's again numerous things. I want to highlight one way you could engage this. Every time I read this, one of the things that stands out is the repetition of two simple phrases. The first simple phrase is "and God said." You can see that there in verse 3, verse 4, verse 9, verse 11, verse 14, verse 20. Just a repetition of the simple phrase "and God said." And in each instance, he speaks, and whatever he speaks comes into being. So he says, "And God said, let there be light." There was light. Uh, and so just noticing that pattern, but then the conclusion of each day, or after he creates, is you see the repeated phrase of, "and it was good." So God is sovereignly creating, and he is approving of everything he creates. And that would make sense that God is creating a good earth, a good world, a good universe. And he even concludes in verse 131, "And God saw everything that he had made, and behold, it was very good. And there was evening and there was morning, the sixth day." So even after the sixth day, it was very good. So at the end of creation, it's the conclusion is it is very good. And so that's one way to engage the text. That's something that stands out to me. And then you can take that and ask the question, what does this say about God? And this one is, again, kind of self explanatory, but I think as we answer that question, it's going to help us apply this passage, because it's one thing to say, yeah, okay, this was happening. I say a repeated phrase. Okay, well, now what? Well, if we think, okay, what is this telling us about God? That God is sovereign, and he speaks and things come into being. So God is sovereign. He is all powerful. But the things that he's speaking into being are good. That he is also all good, and we see that in this passage. Uh, and so, if you don't ask that question, what does this say about God? You may not take the time to really think about what this is really saying. But here we can see that, yes, he is majestic, all powerful. He is sovereign. He speaks and things come into being. He speaks and good things come into being. And as you think about it like that, then the discipleship application becomes easier. So you can ask, okay, how am I supposed to apply this as a disciple? Well, there's a couple of ways. One, if you think about, and God said, and whatever he says comes to be. And how often do we maybe fight against that? That God may tell us to do something, he may say something, and yet in our life, it's not. We're hesitant to fall in line. Whereas here we see in Genesis 1, all of creation falls directly in line with what God is saying. So maybe you can, do some inspection in your heart, and okay, and ask yourself, how am I quick to obey God? Is there an area of my life where I am being slow to obey? So that's one way you could apply the passage. Another way would be maybe you're just discouraged, and due to brokenness in the world, maybe brokenness in your own life, and you can be reminded that a good God created a good world, and that sin came in and created this brokenness, but a good God came to save us, and he is going to bring redemption. And so, as you think about that, and you think about the goodness of God in creation, the goodness of God in his character, it can encourage your heart if you're going through a tough time. It can encourage your heart, can encourage someone else that may be going through a tough time, and you could share that with them. You could meditate on the goodness of God. You could meditate on the sovereignty of God. All of those are ways you could apply this passage. And as you're applying the passage in those ways, you're going to better um, put your life in orbit around God and have him at the center.